And when he does that, God heals from the inside out. And what we learn is that the mind, the body, and the heart are all different centers. Gotta get the pegs right. All different centers that Satan can interact with, but he can't touch our soul. Now, when we go into Song of Songs, we find something rather interesting. That as you read the book as a whole, you find out that for guys and girls, they're structured. These same 4 parts are layered differently. For the man, he's going to see, then he's going to think, and then he's going to feel. Right? And for the woman, she's going to see, she's going to feel, she's going to think about him, and then she's actually going to go looking for him. So as you can see from this, you have the 4 parts different. For guys, it will go body, mind, heart. And for women, generally speaking, it will go heart, mind, and body. What does that mean? That means for a guy to initiate physical contact is fairly innocuous. That allows us to do things like go into battle or fight without getting too emotionally attached about it. Whereas women will look at it and say the fighting is silly, and then they will say things that guys would kill each other over. Because for them, generally speaking, not always, the emotion is much further out from the protection of the soul. But why did God structure it this way? Well, God says that the 2 become 1. So by yourself, if you never get married, and God made you to never be married, you can stay this way perfectly fine all your life. And we could put things on it, and it's solid, and it's stable, and it's complete. But if God intended for you to marry, and those were the only 2 types of people he said that he made, then he meant you to come together. So we represent that this way, a rectangle. And it's not perfect. It's just an illustration. So don't get too wrapped up into the shape. But, and we'll explain all the rest of this as we go. But if God intended you to come into this in this shape, then you can see the 2 become 1. Now, many people consider that a spiritual allegory. The 2 are going to become 1. The 2 will become 1 in Christ. And that is somewhat true, but it is, in the eyes of God, literally true. We get that from the book of Job. In the first 2 chapters in Job, something very interesting happens. We all know that Satan goes and he asks to test Job, and God says yes. And then God in chapter 1 puts only one restriction on Satan. It is that Satan cannot touch Job himself. So Satan goes and he takes all the animals and he takes all the money and he kills all the kids. In chapter 2, Job's wife shows up. And no, I don't believe that's because she was on Satan's side. I think we misunderstand Job's wife. But that's another Bible study for another time. She's there because Satan can't physically touch her, because to touch her is to touch Job, because the 2 are spiritually one creature in the eyes of God. And if done right, we form a very solid, cohesive shape. So let me explain what I mean by that. So the first thing God tells us is that we should not be unequally yoked. So that means that your partner should also be a Christian. So we're going to use this rubber band, good purple rubber band, as an image for how God interacts with us. So the first thing men and women should be doing is looking at it and saying, is he a Christian? Is God in my life? And if God's not in the other person's life, dating to save rarely works. I won't say never, but rarely. But if you do it right, God brings you together and you're in this shape. And these are 2 connection points that only God can control. So if the other person's not a Christian, it looks like that. And as we can see, it doesn't resemble the same shape. It requires external force to keep it there. If the other person is a Christian, it's a little easier. Doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's solid. As you can see when I maneuver it around, it's there. pulls it apart pretty easy. But when I pull it apart, there's no damage to either object. Both parties are fairly safe. But you've brought it together safely, and you're in a shape that God desires you to do it. Now, in our society, the next people to normally find out about this budding relationship, if they didn't actually bring it together, are your friends, represented by the pink band here. The pink band, it's not a strong band, and it doesn't connect the same way that God does. It doesn't have the same reinforcing structure, but it does reinforce. Now, if they're all Christians and they're pulling in the same direction, life is great. But if your friends aren't so friendly, it doesn't take much to start knocking things out of position. And so while it's a useful reinforcing, it's not the limiting thing. And so God's next ideal step is to get the family involved. As you remember, as you may know, if you read this book of Ruth, before Boaz even talks to Ruth, he talks to his friends. And then he talks to Ruth a little bit. And then he talks to Naomi, her family. So at some point in God's ideal world, when you start dating, you first bring in God, then you bring in friends and family. And again, you can pull it apart. It's harder now. But you can pull it apart, and again, no damage. It slides in and out of shape. But it's not fixed. It doesn't have to be. Now, here comes the trouble. So, in our society, we tend to look at love as an emotion. Love is something you feel. You fall in and out of love. And if you look at love that way, as an emotion, it does something very interesting. It actually makes this fairly solid surface. Let me remove this and I'll show you. I can move this around and it's okay. It's not going to do anything. But if I look at love as an emotion, as something that comes and goes, it's a feeling like anger or happiness or depression, comes and goes. Then all of a sudden something interesting happens. It actually destabilizes the entire structure. And it's interesting because God tells us in Corinthians 13, the love chapter, that love is patient, kind, gentle, long-suffering, etc. Love is actually a choice. And when I look at love as a choice, now I have something that'll bind two minds together. And as a choice, it's harder to pull away. It can take shape. And again, no real damage is occurring. But now this relationship is more solid. I can bend it, I can shake it, I can move it. And it pulls out of shape a little bit, but not too much. And again, no damage, because God wants us to have healthy relationships that will survive time. Whether that's a boyfriend, girlfriend, or a spouse. Now, done in correct order, God's way, the next step that we're going to commit is marriage. We've decided we love each other, the families like each other. So now we're going to add a legal ceremony. With this comes the full protection of the law. Right? And I apologize, it's upside down, so let me fix that. But you have the full benefit of the law. The law is going to provide property rights. It's going to protect for children, etc., etc., etc. Expectations of behavior for both parties. It's going to happen because it's legal. There are obligations. For instance, in the military, if somebody is legally your spouse, the military has to talk to them in the event of a disaster. But now, as we can see, if we've done everything the way God says, it holds its shape pretty well, and it doesn't shake up too much. And then, after the ceremony, after You've done all this. Then God brings in sex. And sex was designed to do two things. Do one thing. Bond one person's body to another person's body and their heart to each other. Now, as you can see, the interesting dynamic here created is that it unites a guy's body and heart with a woman's body and heart. And that's significant because if you look at any secular song where they talk about going all the way, from the girl's point of view, sex is going all the way. But the songs very clearly indicate that going all the way for a guy is actually marriage. Sex is just sex is getting lucky. It's like playing roulette. It doesn't mean much. But for a guy, marriage is significant. Now, for a guy, and we'll explore this a little bit more, as he has more and more sex partners, damage is created. But for a guy, what happens is the heart component comes out. And it becomes harder and harder for him to emotionally connect because men are emotionally fragile. It's just the things closest to the soul are what we care about. Women care about their looks, guys have their pride. It's just kind of the way it goes. But if we do it right, God's way, the way He tells us to do it, then all of a sudden we have a very solid relationship. You can knock it around, you can fling it, toss it, and it stays in shape. It can get hit, stays in shape. Not going to damage it much. Now, sex becomes a glue, and it will permanently bond these two pieces. Every guy remembers the first girl he had sex with, the first girl he kissed, the first girl's hand he held, and every woman does too. Now, guys, if they have multiple partners, will forget some of them, depending on how many they have. That's not a good thing, because God intended for us to only have one. So if your parents were to walk in and they found, or you had a child and you came in and you found them cutting on their arm over and over and over again, we would rush them to a psychiatrist. Why? Because something is clearly wrong. Cutting is a sign of needing attention. There's something wrong. It's a cry for help. Well, a one-night stand spiritually is no different. It is cutting yourself over and over and over again because you're bonding with somebody incorrectly. There's no love, there's no emotion in there from your perspective, from one party's perspective, and it's causing damage. And what happens is holes are beginning to be created. And we'll address that a little bit further. But let's look at what this would do if we do it wrong, which is where this really becomes psychologically and educationally more valuable. So we peel all this off. And the first thing we do is we remove the God component. I'm going to date a non-Christian. What does God do? Well, God sits with the one person He's in. He sits right there. And as you can see, He can't do a whole lot to keep these two together. But they want to be together, so they're there, and they're trying to maintain that shape. Well, what do? Well, we're going to say that we love each other. Well, that pulls you out of shape and unstable if anything happens to you. Not really designed for the rigors of surviving time. So we repair that damage, we come back together and say, oh, well, it's not be enough. We need to express it. Well, the first time, for both parties, if they're both virgins, you get a shape that looks like that. It's a little off on the corners, but now you're bonded in that shape. And the only way for God to bring you back into correct shape eventually is to break that mold. That will not be a pleasant process. But let's say the guy has had multiple partners. Now all of a sudden, it looks like that. The damage is more pronounced. And in addition, there would be jagged edges along this line because the guy is not perfectly smooth. He's bonded and attached before and created his own damage. So, there's that aspect. But let's say we were both Christians. Well, okay, so we're starting to do things right again. So let us put it back in position. Forgive me. So we put it back in position and we say, okay, we're two Christians. We met in the youth group. We're great. We both love God. We're here in this shape. And we decide we're going to have sex because that's what the world's told us to do. And there we are. Oddly enough, you're even a little more pronounced than you were without God. That's not unusual. It's just now there's an indication of damage. It's not unrecoverable. It's just going to be painful to correct. Okay? And if, as we work on that, what we'll find is that bringing those other things involved makes things somewhat better. But to make this work again, you're going to have to move back into position a little bit. So, that's sex before marriage, sex outside of marriage. Now let's say we do something else. We decide, God doesn't know what he's talking about. We're going to have sex with multiple partners. Well, what'll happen is eventually there will be jagged little holes all through this. Now, we don't show it on this one. But there will be jagged little holes which will make this bond a whole lot less secure. Because if both people have jagged little bonds, essentially what you get is what you see right there. Little tiny holes developing. Doesn't make it as flush, doesn't make it as smooth, doesn't make it as solid. It doesn't mean there's no hope. It just means that there's damage. But let us consider for a moment something that's plaguing our society right now. Why does God care about homosexuality? Well, when you look at homosexuality, God has some strong terms for it, but he associates those terms in the same place that he associates eating incorrect food or offering to incorrect gods. And that is, you're bonding to the wrong shape. So for a moment, we're going to take this one, and we're going to point it out that it's the same now as the other one. You formed this shape. Well, you already have a God component that puts things in the way, and it creates a little bit of a barrier. But now my love component is only going to be that strong, which isn't a very strong bond. It certainly can't control all of that. But then we're going to take this subject of sex, and sex is still going to try and bond the heart, the bodies, with the other heart, way over here. And unstable. So again, not exactly productive. And now, if we're going to truly examine it, the jagged edge would be all over this side. And we see that in the homosexual relationships depicted in the Bible. We see that dilemma. Now, let's ask the question of, well, what about multiple wives? Well, if you have multiple wives, you start to introduce that gap. And what do you get with that gap? Damage. And what do we see with Jacob and his 2 wives? Abraham and his 4 wives? Every time you have multiple wives, you introduce this damage. And what does Jesus say? In the beginning, God created Adam and Eve. 1 man, 1 woman, bound for life. And that's what God intended for us to do. But then we can also ask this question, what about pornography? Pornography does a couple of things. Pornography is a problem, 1, for both sexes. But 2, pornography does different things. So for a guy, pornography is visual. And that's what we tend to think of, Playboy, Hustler, those sorts of things. Because guys are outwardly focused, physically focused. Women are emotionally focused. Their pornography tends to be romance novels where men are highly emotional and vulnerable. Interestingly enough, if you study both subjects, I don't recommend that you go watch them. You don't have to. The general plots are out there. In a romance novel, the woman is the object of worship. She's the one everybody chases. She's the one everybody's thinking of. Everybody's reacting to her. In pornography, visual pornography, the man is the object of worship. Everybody's looking to do whatever they can to worship him. What's really going on? Pride. To sum it all up, it's pride. And as it amplifies, pretty soon you need more and more pride because your pride can't fill you up. A prideful man is easily offended. But a humble man, he seems to survive the world just fine because he's content. He's filled from another source. So we have that problem, but interestingly enough, what we have in an ideal relationship is the guy sees and does. He sees, he thinks, he feels, which is communicated to the woman as she feels, she thinks, and she does. And you can see we complete a nice little circuit that will bring them together. But when I introduce pornography, something else happens. It goes from body to mind to heart, but now it goes deep into my own soul. And that creates two different currents. And these currents, rather than pulling together like they used to, begin to pull you apart. And in the studies done on pornography, you can see TED Talks and other things like that. They find that actually, yes, that's exactly what it does. It tends to make people isolated and alone with false senses of reality. I mean, porn stars without their makeup are not necessarily as beautiful as they look on the movies. Even the actors and actresses don't look the way they really look. And so they have that problem. So you have that. Now, I was talking to another guy, and he was talking about people who had been sold into the sex trade. The human slavers who are capturing these poor people and forcing them into the sex industry. And there are two questions that come up. For the guy, the question is, will anyone ever choose to love me again? And the answer is yes. They're redeemable. For the woman, it's another interesting question of, will I ever be loved? And the answer is yes. But interestingly enough, many of them then say, but am I redeemable in a way? Who's going to want to marry me? And the answer is, God has found a way for that. Because the reality is, there's a tradition in Christian marriages that the woman wears white and the man wears black. The man wears black because he's a stand-in for Jesus Christ. And the black represents the sin of the church that he takes on. And the woman in the ceremony represents the church. And she is presented before the people as pure and blameless and holy. Because the groom wears black, the bride can always wear white. And what the groom is saying is that if anyone has an issue with his bride, they can take it up with him. Because he takes on her sin. So that's it in a nutshell. You can kind of play with the rubber bands as you see fit. And if you have questions or comments, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks. God bless.